And now it's time for the Christian Science Monitor for Thursday, December 24th, 2020. My name is Pam, and let's begin. Multi-generational households confirm the more the merrier by Chelsea Shaisley. When Ashley Guevara and her husband Alfredo Guevara feel overwhelmed by managing their full-time jobs while raising 2-year-old twins during a pandemic, they breathe a huge sigh of relief that they moved in with extended family earlier this year. The couple and their children live with Mr. Guevara's mother in the same house where he grew up in Somerville, Massachusetts. Next door, in a connected house, live Mr. Guevara's aunt and cousin. Life flows fluidly between the two spaces, with family members sharing meals, watching TV together, and caring for the twins. We moved in 2 weeks pre-quarantine in early March, said Ms. Guevara. I don't know what we would have done if we were still in a tiny apartment with growing toddlers working from home. Although the benefits of living with family are especially clear during a pandemic, with in-home childcare, companionship, and a lowered cost of living, the Guevaras decided to move into their multi-generational house before they heard of the coronavirus. And, like a growing number of others living in similar situations, they plan to stick with it after the pandemic and economic crisis fade. I love that my kids get to spend so much time with their family, says Ms. Guevara, a social worker who works from home during the pandemic. Her husband is a nurse at a children's hospital. A peak in an ongoing trend? Across the United States, families are living together in record numbers as they respond to public health and economic calamities. The number of 18 to 29-year-olds living with their parents this year rose from 47% in February to 52% in July, according to the Pew Research Center, surpassing the previous peak set during the Great Depression. Families living together in multi-generational households also accelerated after the Great Recession in 2008. We see families turning to each other in difficult times, says Jaya Peterson Lent, Deputy Executive Director of Generations United, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that promotes connections among people of different ages. During COVID, we're seeing families come together for a variety of reasons. It may be caregiving. It may be a way for social connections during a time of lots of isolation. Yet, American families aren't only moving in together during troubled times. The percentage of the U.S. population living in multi-generational families has grown steadily since the 1980s and hit a record 20% of the population, or 64 million people, in 2016, according to a 2018 Pew Research Center report. Pew defines multi-generational households as those with 2 or more adult generations or with grandparents and grandchildren under age 25. Experts believe the long-term increase in multi-generational households is due to a combination of demographic changes, falling wages, and rising student debt. In addition, cultural changes are shifting the way Americans perceive the role of family, with many questioning whether living as private, independent nuclear families is still attainable or an ideal worth striving for. We reflect often back on 2009, and what we saw then was many families were coming together out of necessity. They stayed together by choice because of the desire to maintain those connections, says Ms. Peterson Lent of Generations United. Benefits for young adults. Most of the multi-generational families interviewed for this article, across races, ethnicities, income brackets, and geographic locales, said the benefits of living together outweigh the drawbacks, and they have no plans to change in the near future. A few are waiting until family members are on better financial footing before moving out or feel they need to branch out on their own soon for more independence. Lindsay Brooks, a 26-year-old from Forestville, California, who finished paying off student loans from college and graduate school this fall, said she paid the loans 10 times faster because she lived at home rent-free with her mom for the past 3 years. With a recent job promotion and a boyfriend, however, Miss Brooks is thinking about leaving her childhood home. It definitely has been worth it, she said, but I think it's important for people to set a timeline and not get caught down that rabbit hole of not having to pay for anything and focus on moving on and moving out. Adult children living at home for practical and financial reasons is nothing new. Earlier in American history, family life centered around a farm or family enterprise, says Stephen Ruggles, a professor of history and population studies at the University of Minnesota. Multi-generational families were common because at least one child would remain living in their parents' home to inherit the family farm or business. The recent rebound in multi-generational living has mostly to do with changing characteristics of younger generations, says Dr. Ruggles, such as declining marriage rates, a rising number of unemployed or underemployed young adults, and increasing racial and ethnic diversity. I think it's been pretty consistent over the last 150 years that most intergenerational co-residence of older people with their adult children has been intended to aid the children, not the old people, said Dr. Ruggles. Family closeness and financial support. The number of individuals living in multi-generational households is growing across racial and ethnic groups, although white Americans remain less likely to live with extended families. A Pew Research Center analysis of 2016 census data showed that 29% of Asian households in the U.S. are multi-generational, followed by 27% of Hispanic households, 26% of Black households, and 16% of white households. Foreign-born Americans are more likely than those born in the U.S. to live in multi-generational families. Wilma Walker lives in Florissant, Missouri, in a 4-generation household with her husband, her 97-year-old mother, her adult daughter, and 2 grandchildren. She says that within the Black community in the U.S., she's always known it to be like a support in our culture. When our parents get older, one of the children in the family automatically makes plans for that. Ms. Walker's adult daughter moved back home 5 years ago after her marriage dissolved, and the family has stayed together, both for financial reasons and because they enjoy living together. You have all these generations who are able to pour wisdom and love into each other, says Ms. Walker, who is a minister. The hardest part is blending the needs of the oldest and youngest member of the house, with Ms. Walker having to remind her grandkids not to run too loudly over her mother's bedroom. Courtesy of the Walker family. Wilma Walker and her family decorate a Christmas tree in their home in Florissant, Missouri in late November 2020. Ms. Walker lives with 4 generations of family. Evelyn Whitfield, Howard Walker, Melita Nimrod, Wilma Walker, Andrea Walker, and Amir Nimrod. Balancing needs and risks across generations has taken on new meaning during the pandemic. A 2017 study by researchers at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health found some health benefits to multi-generational living, but also cautioned that overcrowded houses can be a risk factor for spreading diseases among families. Victor Gonzalez from Lawrence, Massachusetts, worries about bringing the new coronavirus home because he works outside the house at a labeling company. But he doesn't want to move out of the apartment where he lives with his parents, grandmother, and younger brother because he knows his parents need the financial support he provides. It was really hard to move back home because the last thing I wanted to do was be out and come back. But then I saw that they needed the help, says Mr. Gonzalez, who moved home last year after separating from his former partner. He pays half the rent and helps with the groceries and bills. His mom watches his young son during the day, and his dad is trying to start a new business after selling his taxicab company. I don't have as much privacy living with my parents, Mr. Gonzalez said, but it's all a matter of time until I see they're settled. I want them to not have to worry about being short on the rent. Planning for multi-generational families. Last spring, a highly read article in The Atlantic called "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake" by David Brooks argued that shifts over the 20th century from bigger extended families to smaller nuclear families led to family structure that liberates the rich and ravages the working class and poor. Among the highly educated, family patterns are almost as stable as they were in the 1950s. Among the less fortunate, family life is often utter chaos. There's a reason for that divide. Affluent people have the resources to effectively buy extended family in order to shore themselves up, Mr. Brooks wrote. He suggests reprioritizing multi-generational families or creating forged families, a term coined by Daniel Burns at the University of Dallas, by developing friends who can act like family. Government and businesses can support multi-generational families by changing local zoning laws to allow more houses built to accommodate separate spaces for multiple family members. A survey by John Burns Real Estate Consulting found that 44% of new home buyers want to be able to accommodate their aging parents someday. Congress could also provide more funding for the Older Americans Act, which was reauthorized this year and provides for a national family caregiver support program for those caring for qualifying family members, as well as grants for multi-generational programs such as joint adult and child daycare centers. Strategies. Strategies for thriving across generations. For those living in multi-generational families, it takes effort to smooth friction over household chores or differences in personality traits. But the effort is worth it, says Ms. Walker from Four Generation Missouri Household. She advises people to be patient and think about how they care for their family members. When you're living in a house, it's an opportunity to be selfish. It's your kitchen, your pot, your TV, she says. But it feels horrible to feel not wanted, and maybe that person needs you right then because they don't have a place to go. That's the way I like to live in my house. I like to serve. I get a rewarding feeling from that. Setting clear expectations regarding shared and individual time, finances, and chores help too, says Ms. Peterson Lent of Generations United. We recommend having time for a family meeting to talk about boundaries and ground rules and get buy-in from family members. For Ms. Guevara, a white American who married into a Filipino-American family, the shift in cultural attitudes towards family has been beneficial. She grew up in a small family without many kin nearby. When she traveled with her husband to the Philippines, she realized that his family had recreated their original living situation in the U.S., with family close together in the same Massachusetts neighborhood. There's this communal way of living there where nobody's too far away. It's very typical for families of multi-generations to be in one household, she said. I just think there's something really amazing about that, and something that's really lost on a lot of people here because there's this norm of moving halfway across the country. Ms. Guevara is quick to add that she doesn't think it's wrong for people to move far away from family, but it's a different cultural approach. Close family ties are something that I really appreciate about his culture, and I'm excited to have my kids be a part of it, she says. And moving on, Europe wants to set green standards. Can it get the world to commit? By Lenora Chu. In Berlin, in 2019, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen boldly declared Europe's man on the moon moment as she announced the continent's plans to be carbon neutral by 2050. The European Green New Deal would, among other bold proposals, have Europe's greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 decarbonized the energy sector and influence environmental standards internationally by raising Europe's own. But the European Union produced only 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, so having what it widely considered the world's most ambitious climate change policy plan isn't enough to fix the problem. And so, to realize its green ambitions, the EU intends to reach beyond its borders to bring along countries including the United States and the globe's #1 polluter, China. The challenge is determining who can be coaxed to come along for the ride and what levers Europe can pull, such as a carbon tax on imported goods, to bring them on its turbulent journey towards a greener future. Stringent climate policy will create winners and losers in society, said Sonia Peterson, a climate economist at the Kyle Institute for the World Economy. Industries will have to change. New fields of work will be created, but ultimately, EU climate policy is of little help alone. It will be very important to get the US and China on board to reach temperature targets of the Paris Accord, though I think it can be helpful to show how decarbonization can work in Europe first. We have to take everyone with us. Europe's leadership intends to leave no person behind as it attempts to overhaul nearly every sector, from transportation to agriculture to energy, via regulation and legislation. The biggest challenge within the next couple of years will be to design this transformation in a way that brings people along, says Vicky Ducha, business climate policy analyst at the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovative Research. We have the goal to take everyone with us. If we do it right, there will be new jobs created. This transformation won't be possible without the people. Ironically, the COVID-19 pandemic has presented an opportunity. Not only has the world at a standstill triggered in a sharp reduction in carbon emissions, but it has allowed the EU to roll out a stimulus package in which roughly 275 billion, I believe, pounds, which equals $335 billion, has been dedicated to a recovery effort that will also combat the effects of climate change. In principle, I think Europe's goals are reachable, says Dr. Peterson of the Kyle Institute. Many studies show with which mixture of technology we can become completely carbon neutral. But in reality, this is a huge challenge and we're far from the goal. The steps that are missing are much more demanding, and that's what's already been achieved. The path is clear in certain industries such as energy, but more challenging in emission-heavy sectors such as agriculture and transportation. Liquid fuels seem to be the best way to decarbonize transportation. Yet we have ideas about a climate-neutral liquid gas, but we're far away from generating the amounts necessary, says Dr. Ducha. The same holds for agriculture. There are only a handful of technological possibilities to reduce methane, and we'll also have to change our dietary habits. That's hard to address from a political point of view. And the transition could spark a public backlash as it starts to affect jobs. It already is at the world's oldest Mercedes-Benz plant in the Marienfelde region of Berlin. This year, Daimler management announced plans to phase out combustion engine production there as the company turns towards electric motors. The factory, which Daimler has run since 1902, might be downsized, prompting hundreds of workers to protest earlier this month. You can't just stop using the internal combustion engine right away, says Henke Fesinger, who along with her husband was marching on a cold, overcast day. She started at the plant as a lathe operator 38 years ago and is now a test equipment instructor. This factory shouldn't be closed down just because some CEO missed the boat for e-mobility. The transformation needs to go slower. Setting standards even outside Europe. Even if Europe convinces its own people to embrace the green path, it remains to be seen whether other countries will follow along. The U.S. has a stated goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050, while China this year announced plans to peak CO2 emissions in the year 2030 and aims to become carbon neutral by 2060. The three biggest emitters are China, the US, and the EU, with everyone else trailing in their wake, says Jeremy Shapiro, Research Director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Any sort of three-way agreement with them would set the tone. That might include, say, setting a standard for assessing the carbon content for exported industrial goods. Yet the U.S. policy-making environment is incredibly polarized, and America is emerging from 4 years under a president who refused to acknowledge climate science. Meanwhile, China, for decades the world's factory floor, can't easily curb emissions in an economy still so reliant on a coal-powered industrial sector. If other countries do not follow along, Europe may need to deploy its unmatched regulatory capability and the mechanisms that spring from that to increase its sovereignty and ability to act, says experts. That includes a border carbon adjustment, which the EU intends to finalize in 2021. Such an adjustment is most likely to take shape as a tax levied on imports into the EU, pegged to the amount of greenhouse gases emitted in their manufacture. This carbon tax is being discussed in part because international cooperation might fall short. It would attempt to subject international industry to the same terms of competition as those inside Europe. Under such a scheme, Dahmer would derive little benefit from shuttering an engine factory in high regulation Germany, moving production to a more permissive China, and importing engines back into Europe. Simultaneously, such a tax would hamper foreign manufacturers from selling dirty products to Europe. In other words, a carbon tax helps level the playing field. Conceptually, it makes a lot of sense, says Mr. Shapiro of ECFR, because if you don't do something like this, the carbon would essentially get exported abroad. But it's a very, very difficult thing to implement. That's not only because of the diplomatic tension that would result, or the uncertainty around whether such a scheme would be compliant with World Trade Organization rules. There's also the intricate logistics of determining the carbon content of an import. It might require insight into 6 different countries' supply chains before you even get to Europe, says Mr. Shapiro. Most exciting for the near term, says experts, is the industrial policy Europe would deploy in the race to develop green technologies. In certain sectors, including renewable energies, Europe has already shown the green choice can be low cost enough to be profitable. That's giving people money, says Mr. Shapiro. That's always a bit easier to push through. I think we're moving on to our next article. Unpacking Great Aunt Gertrude's plum pudding. As a child, I knew her only as the quirky lady with the odd gifts. It turns out there was much more. By Merv Brewster. In your standard Christmas story, there's a familiar fruitcake that makes the rounds every year and doubles as a doorstop until it's mailed to the next victim. The tradition is easy enough to maintain since it doesn't involve any real work other than annual retrieval and a trip to the post office. Certainly, nobody's expected to eat it. Our family bucked the tradition. We ate it. But then again, ours was not a fruitcake. It was an honest-to-goodness plum pudding, and it thudded onto our porch every December, courtesy of Great Aunt Gertrude. This was the real thing, an authentic, antique confection produced with love, or at least a sense of obligation, by an authentic antique woman. Great Aunt Gertrude was born in 1869, which is remarkable enough, but her holiday treat was positively medieval. The plum pudding arrived faithfully, as did the white cotton gloves for my sisters and me at Easter. I wasn't much for white cotton gloves. It was just one of those little old lady things, and my great aunt was very little and very old. That's about all I could say about her. I was said to be an imaginative child, but visualizing this tiny woman as a vibrant and interesting person was beyond my powers. But I'll give her this: her plum pudding could outpunch anybody's fruitcake. Mom would make a hard sauce to go with it, and we happily gobbled it up. Once a year did the trick, though. It was rich. It was ridiculously rich, black hole dense, and plenty mysterious. So recently I looked up the recipe. Gertrude's plum pudding must have been a production. There were no plums in it. Dried fruit and spices might have prevailed but for the cognac, eggs, and more than a pound of suet. Without a doubt, the suet would have been procured from an unwilling local bovine, perhaps one Gertrude knew personally, delivered by knacker wagon. Plus fresh breadcrumbs derived, of course, from freshly baked bread. The reason the bread needed to be fresh is lost to history, because the entire operation has to be started literally 1 year in advance and the product stored somewhere away from open flames until it settled down. Then it was placed in a box and cushioned with crumpled pages from the Daily Hampshire Gazette, tied with twine, addressed, strapped to a mule, and hauled to the post office. This was truly an act of love. That it was, my father said, in a tone that suggested there might be more to the story. I mean, she did this her whole life, and she made it to 97, I said. Well, it's possible she signed the card till then, but my father said it was Great Aunt Caroline who made the pudding, warehoused it until it behaved, groomed the mule that lugged it to the post office, and maybe consoled the herd of suet donors. Caroline was ever and always the youngest sister. Gertrude had 4 years on her, and they lived together for decades, spinsters both, sharing stationery with the Mrs. Brewsters, printed in a florid script. Spinsters, the term used to carry that stain of unsuitability, even failure. It's not even a concept anymore, and barely a word, but by now I was old enough to be curious. Did either of them ever want to marry? Caroline did fall in love, my father said, but the family did not approve. Of 4 sisters, 1 married, producing 1 son and no resume. And the others? Gertrude graduated from Smith College, studied at Oxford, taught, was the first female trustee of the Forbes Library in Northampton, Massachusetts, and dean of the high school there. Mary Kate wrote books and plays and had traveled around the world twice before she was 26. Caroline, also a Smith grad, went to New Mexico, where she studied the cliff dwellers. She taught math in 3 other states and worked as a computer for Columbia University's astronomy department. Evidently, it takes a lot of living to become a proper little old lady. After Great Aunt Gertrude died, Caroline plugged on, bright and agile, to the age of 104. I don't know if we got a plum pudding after Gertrude was gone. I was on my own by then. But I haven't forgotten it. Sometimes even stories can be richer when you know the ingredients. Well, my friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for December the 24th. My name is Pam. Please have a wonderful season's greetings. Be safe, be blessed, and do what you can do to make it a great day.